Do you hear it? The calls of angels, devils, life itself. It's grown so loud.
Hey all, Siege here, and welcome to episode 3 of Siege Thoughts, where I go over aspects of the lore in a less formal manner in order to present more of my feelings and opinions on certain things within the game. Even ideas I think I understand, but haven't yet gathered the necessary data to prove it, or even ones that maybe don't translate as well to the typical videos produced on the channel. In this week's episode, I want to discuss an idea that I'm seeing pop up more and more frequently in both comments and stream chats, and that is, first, if the man on the wall is some kind of god, some kind of corrupted aspect of the cosmos, or one I don't hear people talking about so much, but I think still exists a possibility of, is a kind of induced shared hallucination, perhaps even one associated with the idea of the Warframe universe being a kind of simulation, rather than having the beautiful and terrible otherworldly effects and powers that we see in the game being some level of unreality or even magic. Given the Orokin and how they operate, attempting to control all facets of their existence, and by extension everyone they govern as a byproduct, as much as I prefer this not to be the case, I can't help but admit it really does clear up, well, every issue really anyone would have with the timeline shenanigans that seem to make every new update so hard to completely grasp, at least at the time each piece of content is released. But before we get too deep into that, I'd first like to thank the channel members. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your support, but also just feel blessed that you value my content enough to help out as you do. Also, I can't forget my longtime channel support from G Fuel, product I continue to use, and given its longevity on the market, I believe that speaks as much as anything as to its actual effectiveness and preference among many people who, like myself, every once in a while need a bit of a mental boost. And the fact that I've tried so many and only choose to continue to use a very few at this point, this being one of them, is about the best endorsement I can give. So thanks again for the continued support. And now, back to gods and Warframe. So I was thinking about this the other day whenever I was coming out of a stream, and it's something that I've been seeing a lot of. It's actually been a comment I've seen many times, is what exactly is going on in Warframe at the moment when it comes to gods and creatures that aren't necessarily of the terrestrial, or at least reality plane that we all typically associate with everything in the game. Up until the new war, I think you could make the argument that the man on the wall was some kind of potential hallucination, especially for the operator, something that had potentially come from the void exposure that had happened in excess. But there are a number of different things that within the game that doesn't necessarily completely explain. Even after, when we got more of a confirmation with not only speaking to it many times, but also in the fact that it kind of came out of this reality or this unreality where it came from and showed itself in two forms. And with that, I think the discussion in Warframe changed, because with that visual proof, it was no longer in question what this thing was, rather to what extent was its abilities and its level of, let's say, godliness. And since then, I don't necessarily believe that we've got a lot of information to even allow that discussion to flesh out any further, because much of what we hear from entities that are representing the man on the wall specifically always appear to be tricksters of some sort. They always seem to guard information. And I think many of us in the community have come to the realization, or at least have a belief in the idea, that the one thing that the void entity seems to say directly to the operator, and hence to us, the player, the Vulni Zata Evoke Marilok, that thing at the end of the new war, and then again at the very end of Whispers in the Walls, we get to hear this very specific thing. And it's interesting because in the new war, we aren't actually given subtitles for what's said. And it was like a big mystery for a very long time. And so many different interpretations. I had one, other people had different ones. came up for exactly what had been said, because in all reality, when you put it through filters and whatnot, void tongue wasn't something that we understood very well, if at all. And because of that, it made it, very difficult to lock down what word was even coming out. So many people were tying that to the Requiem words that we had at the time. Since then, even though new Requiem words have not necessarily come out, there are all kinds of pieces of information in regards to void tongue that we can now get from different things, lyrics from different songs that came from Whispers in the Walls, and different little pieces of dialogue that are being shown either or heard. Certain situations, the kinemantic messenger, KIM, is probably one of the best places to find all kinds of little tidbits and references to things that I don't think that you would hear or see front and center in a quest, but allow for the idea of these things to actually exist. Yes, they are here, and further, people know about them, and thus they can enact something onto the story as well, which I think is really cool in how the story is going forward. And one of those things that we are kind of seeing more and more frequently is the introduction of Soul and Lua. So before I get too deep into the discussion on Soul and Lua and what they might represent, you have to ask yourself first, are they part of the actual God spectrum here that we have in Warframe, or are they just a belief structure? Are they something that, because the people that are bringing them up more frequently than what we hear, especially after Valis has his whole thing about how the Orokin kind of moved away from dualism as a belief?
Before the vain faith, our people held dualism as truth, that all things were of two parts, mind and body, consciousness and matter, of our world and the void.
And into the vain faith being faith in themselves, in the Orokin, that the Orokin were law, that the Orokin were the order of the universe. And thus they had no need for religion anymore because they were making it happen. If you wanted to live forever, in certain methods, you could with the Orokin. Any possibility was there, and thus they believed themselves to be gods in some way. So it always made me wonder if, when we talk about Soul and Lua, are they just ideas? Are they just things that primitive characters within the Warframe universe had decided, matched up with the sun and the moon, and how those two natural forces would enact upon different things, the tides, and how the world works, and thus we're given a kind of deityship, if you will, that controlled things? Or is there some level of proof that we're going to actually see at some point where those two entities are real and have some level of not just power, because I think even in the natural sense of things, they have power. The sun and the moon have significant power over our, everyday lives. And the same in the Warframe universe. But I'm saying power that's more associated with a god that has some level of awareness of what's going on, and thus can make choices to enact its will in a different way than is typical. I think that we could be moving towards that. I think it's very possible that these two gods are going to have some level of way that they're going to potentially help our operator. And I think that would be a really cool thing to introduce into the game, that there is a level of, beings above what we know in the Warframe universe. That the man on the wall is perhaps just one of these, or that the man on the wall represents one of these things, and that there are other aspects which would actually, a lot of people ask me in this regard, if the man on the wall is defeated or satisfied or whatever, what happens next? Because it's going to be a huge downgrade given the power that the man on the wall has. So in that regard, if we win, if we actually kill the man on the wall, That in itself is kind of crazy to conceive at this moment. But again, you never know what definitively are we going to find out that thing is. And thus, perhaps there is a way. And I guess you could even take the logic that if the man on the wall in its current form was quote unquote created or brought into existence by an interaction with Albrecht and Trotty, that if nothing else, it could be brought back to the existence prior to that. And you could even make the argument that maybe is what Entrati was attempting to do with what was going on in Hollvania during the 1999 Hex Quest saga, trying to destroy that reality. It makes me think, especially given that the man on the wall seems so interested in trying to stop him from doing that he may have been onto something. I don't know what that is. But again, it's interesting that in that whole situation, that very one, in fact, is where we start to see more imagery supporting Sol and Lua. You see within Hollvania Mall, there's, huge images on the floor representing these two gods. And I would say in 1999, given the fact that I lived in that time, I was one of those people that it was rare, almost unheard of in 1999 to see what I would consider to be a religious figure associated in a public mall. Almost to the point that, aside from potentially Christmas and the nativity scenes that you'll see in different things around churches and whatnot now, but yes, I think you could make the argument that every once in a while you would see nativity scenes within malls around that time. But it would only be so associated with that particular time of year, and it would be synonymous with, Santa Claus would also be there, and you'd have like lines of people that were bringing their kids to see Santa Claus. And again, not every situation had these nativity scenes in these, overly public areas that weren't necessarily associated with religion in any way, shape, or form. So the idea that in Hollvania, one of the most shocking or striking images that we get in that mall is this large aspect of Sol and Lua. And not only that, say you weren't attempting to, or say you didn't pick it up. One of the things that's added that I think a lot of people will force people to see that image if they were, going to pass by it normally, is the fact that both of them are holding a skana. Because of the association that has within the Warframe universe, it immediately brings a person who's going by there to, as you walk by, to look at it and say, oh, why are they holding that weapon? And so now you have this additional little Easter egg or clue that's thrown in there that allows kind of a more personal interaction with these two gods that you're looking and saying, oh, well, I had that too. That's my weapon. And it's like I said, it's one of the most famous ones in the game at this point. So I do think that we could be heading toward a scenario where the answer to the question of what would we do if there isn't a man on the wall, or if that saga ends, which you would assume at some point it has to. And I think if you expand, or if the Warframe universe had always been this and we're only learning of it now, if you expand that situation out a little further, where the man on the wall, or this corruption of a time god, if you will, or whatever it is, nothingness, is only an aspect of that reality underneath our reality, and not necessarily the entire force of it. But I think it opens up the doors to a lot of things that will make it a lot easier for DE to come up with new things to get excited over, get to grind in game. Because I really do think like it's having a new Warframe constantly, every couple Warframes a year and whatnot. It's great. I love it. And the Warframes that they do come out with are fantastic. But I think even the ones that are coming out now are a lot more well thought out so that they have better synergies. The abilities themselves are more interesting and unique versus what kind of like the older ones, like the beginning frames had and whatnot. And I think that's amazing. But unless DE is going down the path of looking at Warframes in the same breath that they look at, let's say, weapons, that some Warframes are really mastery fodder. And I don't think that you hear a lot of complaining about that when it comes to weapons in Warframe. That, I mean, there are certain guns you just get and you just know. It's like, hey man, I have no need for this thing. So you level it up and you get it done and you're done. But I don't know if DE wants to go down that route where Warframes themselves are a kind of, like I said, mastery fodder, because they all have an interesting story and likewise should, and are each in their own way a character in the game. Some we know a lot about, like, Umbra, Dante, even, then there's like your median ones like Revenant. But then there's certain Warframes that we know little bit, nothing about. And I think at some point, at least I think the idea was that every Warframe was going to get maybe not a robust story, but at the same time, one that at least satisfied enough that if that particular Warframe was your Warframe, that was the one that you really had, kind of just gravitate towards for whatever reason. It's one of your first ones, or just the abilities just kind of really synergize with the way you like to play, or you just like the design of it. No matter what it is, I think that's the difference with Warframes and weapons, in that I don't think a lot of people are associating themselves with bad weapons in Warframe. But they do associate themselves with what you would consider at the moment bad Warframes. And I mean, we have tons of even creators that, in the past that have kept going with particular Warframes, even though they were not good frames. And I think that, your regular player is no different, that no matter what the reason why, you really got into that particular one. So in that regard, kind of getting back to the initial point is that maybe this new level allows for some other thing to be chased after. And in that, we don't get such an influx of Warframes all the time. Maybe something new comes and replaces one of those new Warframes that we get every single year, thus allowing for DE to expand the game, expand the things that we want to grind for, but at the same time, make it so that all these Warframes don't get kind of lost in the crowd. Because I already think there's a bunch of them. It's interesting. If you can think of one in particular that you love, but that gets no love or hasn't gotten love for a long time, tell me in the comments. I'd be curious to see how many people actually associate with this very concept. But like I said, you give something else that's potentially useful in another aspect of the game, you can satisfy that same need. You can address what you already have, potentially even give lore to certain things that don't have it, because now that's time spent on a new Warframe that you wouldn't have had to have done. So now you can go back to another Warframe where, maybe it's not quite as interesting, the story around them, and you can give them something. And then maybe at that point, when every single Warframe kind of has their own deal, and again, it's not like they're going to go away from adding Warframes. It's the name of the game. But I'm just saying, maybe I just don't want to see tons of Warframes just lose themselves in the crowd. That's the main thing. But again, that's a lore guy saying this. So, take that last part as you will. Getting back to the initial concept, again, I apologize for this little tangent, but it was one that I did want to talk about. Dualism is probably what we need to discuss first whenever we're trying to understand Sol and Lua's place in the game. And I think what we're basically talking about in the grand scheme of things, I will provide links to all of the sources that I am referring to, just so you know. So if you want to look that up after the fact, or even while I'm talking about this, feel free. But as I was looking up dualism as it pertains to Warframe, I think the main aspect of it comes from the idea that a lot of dualism is based upon cause and effect. Hence the need for the mind and the body to have some kind of interaction between. Now, I'm going to read a little bit of what Wikipedia has to say about it. I know it's not the absolute best thing, but I think to people who don't necessarily have any kind of experience with this whatsoever, they'll be able to follow along a lot easier. But they say in the philosophy of mind-body dualism denotes either that mental phenomena are non-physical or that the mind and body are distinct and separable. Thus, it encompasses a set of views about the relationship between mind and matter, as well as between subject and object, and is contrasted with other positions such as physicalism and enactivism in the mind-body problem. And I'm just going to point out certain little aspects of the article. I'm not going to go through every little bit of it, but it does say that dualism is closely associated with the thought of René Descartes, who holds that the mind is a non-physical and therefore non-spatial substance. Descartes clearly identified the mind with consciousness and self-awareness and distinguished this form from the physical brain as the seat of intelligence. Hence, he was the first documented Western philosopher to formulate the mind-body problem in the form in which it exists today. Now, like I said, there's a bunch of other stuff that they want to talk about, but I do really think that there is one association here that I think works for Warframe in particular, and that is interactionism. Interactionism is the view that mental states, such as beliefs and desires, causally interact with physical states. This is a position which is very appealing to common sense intuitions, notwithstanding the fact that it is very difficult to establish its validity or correctness by way of logical argumentation or empirical proof. It seems to appeal to common sense because we are surrounded by such everyday occurrences, such as a child's touching a hot stove, a physical event, which causes him to feel pain, a mental event, and then yell and scream, which is a physical event, which causes his parents to experience a sensation of fear and protectiveness, a mental event, and so on and so forth. So the idea that these two states essentially make up the fabric of everything that we do, that the mind perceives a thing and then the body potentially reacts to it, or the body reacts to a thing, in this case being pain or pressure, and thus the mind must then react to the pain. And what's interesting is, in this regard, especially with all of these events, every single one of them, at least in this particular example that they give, are instantaneous. Meaning that aside from the sense of fear and protectiveness, which I think that may be subjective, but again, if you're a parent, there is what appears to be like kind of an unseen force that pushes you to do certain things, even when you might not even be thinking about it, but it's just this instinctive thing. Now, I'm speaking from my own experience on this and reading certain things. I can't verify that every single person feels that way, but I can certainly attest to it being something that I experience without question. And thus I could see where what they're talking about is a true case, even outside of our reality into the Warframe reality, in that before the Orokin were the quote-unquote gods that they've kind of become, if you will, in their own mind, they had to adhere to the regular states of existence. And thus, their belief structure came about based upon their own observations. That when a thing would happen, that they would respond. And that when they would do certain things, physical events would occur because of it. Cause and effect. Now, what's interesting is when we get into eternalism specifically, we lose that very concept, cause and effect, because we've already seen in many situations that eternalism appears to, in many ways, enact bootstrap paradoxes, in that the paradox itself is what's causing the situation to occur, rather than a cause and effect. The confusion that we have with the Zerman is one of those specific events. You could make the case as well that now we have a situation with the infestation that could be considered a bootstrap. But eternalism allows for all these things. In fact, I would say it even encourages such things. Now, the last episode that I did on it, I think explains why that's essentially okay in Warframe. But you can see that up until that point, this would be a belief structure that would be based upon reality and what they had seen, their basic reality. When you introduce unreality, laws change. And thus, in the case of the Orokin, their entire belief system went away because there was no such thing as cause and effect anymore. They could do whatever they wanted. It's one of the reasons why I do make the argument, too, that I believe unequivocally that the Orokin, with knowledge of eternalism, utilized eternalism. I cannot fathom a situation where they would know about it and further teach about it in their classes, because I would assume the class, TA, when they were taking that on the Zerman in the New War, that's probably not just a class that the children of the Zerman get. That's a class that every Orokin child gets. And it's kind of like, I'll use my government, the American government, but I'm sure, every government at this point. If they have knowledge of such an incredibly powerful thing, and that it is theoretically possible, the idea that they don't have their very best scientists working night and day on it, especially when you look at the Orokin and how they behave and how they are towards other people, like, you're just ignoring too many things that they would be this terrible group of people that would put their the people that were underneath them through horrible things and not care about anything and be willing, even in the case of Ballas, as I had mentioned earlier, that I will get into a little bit later in the video, that, is Warframe a simulation? Well, I can tell you one thing. During the New War years, when the operator wasn't there, that's exactly what was happening. Every single citizen who was wearing the mask was living a simulation based upon whatever he had put in there. So again, already, there's been a run in the game that's actually allowed it. The only difference really is that there was some kind of mechanism that had to be placed on the subject. But that being said, he was only one Orokin. I wonder if you had many Orokin with a singular purpose of doing these sort of things, how feasible would it be? But let's get back to the concept of this idea that the Orokin became the gods versus needing to look at the gods or address the gods as something. And thus, when you think about the concept of a god, it's usually the idea that the god can control some aspect of reality that you want them to keep doing, So you pray to them, you tithe to them, you give offerings. In some religions, you give sacrifice so that they continue to do what they are already doing. Or in the case of certain things, like they make certain events occur that don't happen frequently, like making it rain, things of that nature. And you have the Orokin who have taken all of those things that you pray to, or pray for, I should say, and they've completely removed a need for them. And when you remove the need for a god, then you become essentially the god, especially if you are doing the things that the Orokin are doing. They are able to travel essentially, at least within the confines of the soul system, wherever they want. You see how quickly we get around, and we have an old Orokin orbiter with a Lizette. Imagine where things would be now if the Orokin hadn't been taken down, and that if their conquest would have continued to Tau and further. What would they be? Would they be what you would consider to be more benevolent? Or would they be even worse, more oppressive? I've come to find that typically people that are engaging in terrible behavior if they are not confronted, will always continue to engage in said behavior because there's really no reason not to. And that's really the problem. If you want to use a real life example, if every politician that is convicted of something that's alleged to have done some level of wrongdoing, especially ones that by the idea of the normal citizen, if they just went to jail, if there was no reason that they could give or that they could offer as far as money or anything else like that, influence, whatever, to the people that were judging, and thus they had to follow the exact same set of standards that everybody else did, there would be a change because there would be a consequence. But until there is a consequence there, a real consequence, not just that you have to give up your position or, maybe pay some money, which usually is like such a small bit of what they have or will make that many times it's laughable, And so with such a light punishment, there's just no reason to stop. There's no reason to stop. And with that in mind, with the Orokin, who's there to punish them? I spoke about what occurred in the story with Grandmother, speaking about Nabarus and the Orokin that just thought it funny to take other people's bodies and just play with them and stretch them out in horrific ways that most likely the owner of the body, the original person, would never look the same or be able to function the same ever again. And to them, it was a fun Halloween thing to do. So I ask that when you get to that point where even your fellow man is nothing more than a plaything for you, that you are in fact living as a god, at least in your own mind. And by that logic, who governs gods? It's almost like a universal cause and effect that we're seeing here. If what I've been saying is accurate in the fact that the man on the wall is coming to stop the Orokin, if that's true, we are actually even seeing that whole cause and effect thing in a kind of cosmic scenario where the cause being that the Orokin have corrupted and taken this entire solar system and destroyed it for their own purposes and for a very small group of humans. That the effect is the universe itself attempting to fix that error. It's a kind of a really interesting theme to go back into this whole thing of that whether the Orokin believed that they became the gods, that they had never become the gods really, and that dualism still exists here and holds sway over this reality in the fact that through the void, through the operators, through a bunch of different things, even through Entrati, that the Orokin ended up being taken down. And now it's just basically trying to clean up. The void, in my opinion, if you're looking at the story for where it's headed from my opinion right now, it essentially got most of the cancer out of the origin system. But there are a few little bits of it left in there. Hey, you got to get it all. You got to get it all out. Because if you don't get it all out, it's just going to start to grow again. And I think you could make the argument that it's coming to the realization that the Orokin are such a dangerous thing that it can't even be bothered to try to save this place. And in fact, it would just rather, let's just burn it all down. It's entropy time, which is really interesting when you think about it, that like a godlike figure. I suppose you could even like really tie this to a kind of demiurge thing, where this godlike figure who, if there is this only one God, created humanity, and thus the Orokin came from humanity and grew outside of this thing's control, and to the point where now it has to do whatever it can to clean up the mess. But it doesn't even know how to do it because the mess is such a big thing. And Entrati specifically is this portion of the cancer that just won't go away, no matter what it does. Because of the fact that he is so deeply entwined in the fabric inside the muscle structure of the universe now, with his different things that he's done and experiments to this place and portals to this place and portals to this time, that it's such a magnanimous task that even the indifference is like, I can't help it. I can't do anything, but we got to just destroy all of it. And then that brings you back to Sol and Lua. If they exist within Warframe and are a real thing, not just a concept, are they in line with the Man on the Wall? Is the Man on the Wall a kind of corrupted aspect of one of them that's trying to fix what had happened? And perhaps that's the reason why the universe is so out of balance, because of the situation that either Sol or Lua or both of them together have become themselves corrupted, or were the original entity that had balance over the thing, and then this third entity that has been brought into play with the introduction of Entradi's doppelganger is a concept that they themselves can't control, or that was added into a system that could not sustain it. And because of that, just chaos and all hell's breaking loose. And in fact, it looks like literally we may even get into the concept of what hell really is in Warframe. We may go there. We may see it. We may see that it has levels. We may see that there are people within those levels. And I'll be curious to see what, with each level that you go down, what are we going to be shown? Is it just going to be random, kind of like fiery images? Or will there actually be certain people like on the walls or doing certain things as a different level of purgatory? Perhaps even in certain areas being able to speak to them, or if nothing else, going close to them, hearing different pieces of dialogue that, who knows, maybe are going to like open up the door to an entirely new understanding of everything that's been going on under the surface of Warframe. Because that's really where the story's at right now. Even though we exist in the top part, what's really interesting is what's happening underneath. I'm just not 100% certain if all the attention that DE has been bringing to Sol and Lua, specifically over the last, 2 years or so, in conjunction with already seeing that Father Leon and Marie LaRue, the two new proto-frames, they themselves have a very strong tie to these two gods. And with them having something to do with Rel now, and being able to bind the Man on the Wall, and Father Leon being upset, there's all these little hints. I really can't wait to hear and see. I got to be honest with you. I'm like so excited for this new update. You don't even know. But I really do want to see where everything is kind of, all these pieces are going to fit in everywhere. And if we're going to get like some kind of really definitive idea of the, like I said, the underneath, if that's really what we're going to find out, of like what's really happening in unreality, who knows? Maybe that's going to be like a whole new area. Like it could be an inverse star chart. If you really think about it, a whole new level, a whole new universe just underneath the surface. And you could even make the argument, like when you get there, that like the moon, like already has it, like its position there, or maybe, like that there's some kind of thing that's happened to whatever the moon was supposed to be in this unreality state, because the moon itself was in there. And maybe that's the reason why the moon itself is in such flux, and there's all kinds of issues with it, because it was like the doppelganger of itself. They came together as one for too long. And now the moon is suffering effects that the other planets don't have to deal with, because they have never been to that level of unreality. But who knows what might bring that to pass. And all this stuff then kind of goes back to the idea that there's just a whole bunch of stuff to try to explain in this context. Because the further that I go with this kind of theory, the more events we're going to have that defy explanation. It's just how it is. We've already seen so many as it is right now. So many things in Warframe's story that you can, of course, if you want, you can speculate on it. You can even gather a lot of supporting evidence from the game itself, from dialogue, from images. But it doesn't completely define the story, and it does not explain everything in its entirety. And thus, that is open to new interpretations with new information. And the one that I kind of brought up in the very beginning is the idea that, and again, I don't want this, but I can't ignore the fact that 1999 has always been a very difficult thing for me to come to terms with as far as how it works in the story, because it takes away the idea of cause and effect. And in my opinion, that is something that you just don't remove without some level of explanation. And that's only one thing. There's all kinds of other situations, time, scenarios, multiple dimensions, multiple variations of particular people that we've actually seen in game that defy any type of like what you would call like a logic that can be based within the game that you can hold to in future pieces of content. And that's always been a very difficult thing for myself, and I'm sure for other people who try to tell Warframe's story, because you can never say, well, this is this and that is that. You have to say, well, this appears to be this. Based upon this, this, and this, I believe this is what's happening. But there are very few things in the game that you can specifically say, yes, that's how it is, and that's that. And like I said, it's always been an argument for how hard it is for new Warframe lore people to get in, because if you don't have a lot of the experience of how the story has moved, you don't really have the full story. And thus, invariably, somebody in the comments is going to tell you, hey, you missed this part, you missed that part. I went through it in the very beginning whenever I first started doing lore for Warframe, and that was like in 2017. So the game was only a few years old at that point. And even I messed up now. But one thing I will say, and this is kind of hearkening back to what we witnessed in the New War, and understand this is my least favorite thing, and I hope very much is not the case, but I think there is a discussion to be had where this is a type of simulation. And again, going to the New War, Ballas and Orokin literally did this exact thing to all of the citizenry of the Origin system when we were gone. And to me, that is a crazy idea. But at the same time, it's the fact that we see it happening. Now, again, remember, you could see the mechanism. You could see the mask that they have to wear. Okay, if you're wearing the mask, then you're in that reality, or you're at least experiencing that reality. But there's all these other little things that I always think about. One of the things I've always found very interesting is, I believe the top story is that when you're in your operator form, that is who you are. You, the person, are the operator, and then you wear the Warframe. That's how that is. But there are multiple scenes in Warframe where even your operator has this like line go across, almost like a transference disruption with your transference connection. Even when the operator isn't really in a transference state. And you see this a bunch of different times. It's not like it's just one or two things. Like I can think of it in Apostasy. I believe it's in the New War, whenever your operator gets stabbed. And I've always wondered myself, like, well, okay, what connection is the operator losing there or having an issue with? Because it's certainly not their Warframe, it's behind them. And I thought to myself, well, there is that, that fourth wall break type thing that's in Warframe. It's been in there forever. And it's just going to be one of those things that until Warframe addresses it, I'm still going to believe that the human on the other side are in the game. There are things that prove this, or at least allude to it, if nothing else. Significantly allude to this. But then I think about it, and if somehow the Orokin were able to make some kind of full-on simulation, man on the wall included, it would clean up a lot of things. It would clean up every kind of time issue that was in there. It would clean up issues with transference, little connection breaks and things of that nature. Really any kind of problems that you would have with like 1999 and any kind of paradoxes that may occur or multiple versions of yourself that are shown with, the operator and the drifter, all of that stuff becomes moot. Because within a simulation, especially an Orokin simulation, anything could really go. They could create anything. And I mean, we could end up finding out that Alberic's true goal is just trying to get out. But that may be kind of like in the Matrix, which is a major, major influence of 1999 and the Hex Quest. We may find out that the reason why we weren't able to be told about it was because that we just couldn't handle it. Kind of like in the same way that when Neo comes out of the Matrix for the first time, he too can't handle it. He can't handle that reality, that truth. And like I said, it's this thought process that does kind of allow for many of the issues that are in Warframe that people always have with different aspects of the timeline. And again, you could look at any number of any little thing that you could think in the game that kind of like, you're like, hey, that doesn't really make sense. Now it does. Let me reiterate, I hate this. I don't want this to be the way, but it would make for a plausible explanation for the man on the wall, like literally everything in the game you could think of it. And further, here's something else. It's very interesting that the 7 were destroyed in the way that they were. And I really think you could make the argument that them not having any kind of bead on how the operators really felt, especially when it came to Margulis and to even in celebration of what they had done, to invite however many operators were there, which we don't really know. I would assume as many as were in the war. I don't know why certain operators would be awarded or recognized and other ones would be, off planet unless they were still cleaning up aspects of the war or, policing certain areas, things of that nature, however you want to look at it. But at the same time, I would also assume that those operators that were off planet would have had to have some idea that the other operators were about to overtake the 7. And it just seems to me like for this group of individuals that try to control every facet of their existence and everybody else is around them, that their exit from the Warframe story seemed a little bit manufactured. Now, again, we only really have one story, one full story of one of the executors getting dealt with, if you will. And I'd like to add here that particular executor would make sense as being singled out by the operators and potentially by the other 7 to be a willing sacrifice to make the ruse seem legitimate. Because Tuval was an asshole. And further, I mean, you can even make the case that because they have no memory of it, that maybe some of the operators or all the operators were even in on the whole thing. That certain ones were going to be let go or pronounced dead, but, disappear. But that 1 or 2 would be, let's say, allowed to accept the comeuppance that the operators had to offer. And I say this too because it's funny that in the piece of lore that we have in Laverian talking about when the executors were destroyed, the only one that Druce has claimed escaped further, I should say, than the other ones, being that his demise came on the moon, that being in the Circulus itself, where it very much appears that he's attempting to induce continuity with an operator. So again, I could see the operators kind of not letting him go. He's exceptionally bad in their eyes. He was, of course, the one who set up the entire Zariman situation. He was the one who made all the different decisions that happened after the Zariman void jump problem. And even beforehand, whenever certain citizens were not really on board with leaving with certain problems that still existed within their calculations in making such a large jump. And he was just like, hey, your job is to serve us. That's it. So shut up. If you don't like it, we're going to take your food away. So again, I could see Tuval especially being sacrificed for the cause without question. And the other ones being like, yeah, that guy's an ass. So go ahead, feel free. We're now the six. and kind of go back to my other points. If they were all killed according to Drusus, how did Ballas come back? I mean, unless he's a doppelganger, which I guess you could say is possible. But at the same time, if we're going by what most people assume is the reality of the Warframe story, that he just essentially hid. So if he was able to do it, why not them? And again, now I go kind of all the way out here with this point in that what if some of these things that are happening right now are of Orokin design, Orokin control, even a type of simulation? Yeah, I will state one more time, I really hate this idea, and I hope it's not the one that they go with, but I can't dismiss it out of hand either, because it does make everything work a lot better and a lot faster, and the story just flows. And I mean, I suppose if it were the case, when the reveal would come, it would be one it'd be pretty crazy. That'd be a crazy reveal. Especially, I'd be very curious to see how it was all done and, how they explain certain things. Again, it's probably not going to be the case. I really do think that the man on the wall is a significant god. And I think further on top of that we may find out that there are more than one. And we already know at the end of Lotus Eaters where Margulis or Lotus or Nata, whoever you have, says, can you hear it? Angels, devils. All these things exist in some way, shape, or form. It's just how are they described, and what kind of impact do they make on the story as a whole? When we talk about devils, are we just talking about like devils like Roth and Uriel Warframe? Is that the extent of what a devil, quote unquote, means in Warframe? Or is angels and devils something that we are yet to find out about, that these things do exist and are potentially their own level of, like I said, gods or some kind of ephemeral entity that has power that is outside of the realm of what a normal human or anything else has? It's really tough to say at this point. I do really think that everything is kind of on the table. I know, me personally, I kind of want the man on the wall to be the only god, but I do think the idea of gods being able to challenge each other in the Warframe universe and even perhaps give their augments or their abilities to us in order to challenge other gods does have a very interesting ring to it, and I like where that could go, and I like how it sounds. So I'm not 100% opposed to that. And I do think it would really open up the story in a way that, man, that could just blow the doors off of everything that we already know. Imagine the man on the wall is just one. That going into his realm opens up an entirely new consciousness within the Warframe narrative, that there's a whole new scenario, a whole new place that doesn't abide by the same rules, that we have to, figure out different things, come up with new types of weapons that have different aspects to them that, are based in unreality. It could open up the door to a lot of crazy ass kind of weapons too, all kinds of weird things. Or even abilities. Like, I know we got to see just like for a second. I don't know exactly what the context is with it, but like Roth either summoned a murmur hand or was trying to like fend it off from it trying to get him. I couldn't tell what the context was within seeing that because, it's only a half-second little thing. And we don't really know what his story is yet. But the idea that maybe we could get a true murmur frame or murmur frames with different type of situations like that, where we have multiple arms and stuff that can go through things. And I don't know. It's like, who knows? Maybe even the man on the wall enlists us to fight for it against Sol and Lua. What about that? What about that? Do you see all the fun we could have with this? That's why I don't want it to be a simulation. But I had to put it out there because you just never know. And I would be a fool to try to tell you that wasn't something that could at least be possible within the context of Warframe, with where the story is right now. But D, if you are listening, go the other way. Go that way. Don't go this. Don't do that one. To this. Go the gods, angels and demons and bears. Oh my! The whole 9 yards. Just keep going. I think we could have a lot of fun with that. I really do. I think it's going to be great if that's the way it goes. I would take the one God thing, us kind of going against a God, like a universal constant, if you will, like a corrupted collective unconscious. Yes, I'm down with that. But multiple gods that we could take on aspects of them that they want to imbue on us and stuff like that. And, you could have a syndicate, like a god syndicate system with different gods because there are other mentions of other gods in the game, like Tlaloc is one of them, mentioned a couple different times in the Kinemantic, I think by not only the Drifter, but also Letty. There's multiple situations where, especially the people from Hollvania really have people of Hollvania have a vastly larger belief structure than the people in the current day origin system. And the question is their belief structure just a belief structure, or is it based on some level of real reality? And like I said, now what do? You can get all these different gods in there. And like I said, they could have their own little powers. It could be because Warframe does this. Like Final Fantasy VIII, they could be like guardian forces, where you can summon them onto the battlefields with you. Periodically, they would come in, especially in certain, fights and shit, and do stuff. And oh my God, that would be fantastic. Sign it better than a specter. Give me a summon. Oh man. Yeah, I'm getting a little excited over here. But I think it's something to be potentially excited about. I don't know. You tell me, what do you think about all this? Would you be interested in literal factions of gods that could either they could imbue you kind of maybe in the same breath as a Helminth? They could imbue you with certain capabilities, or even join you in certain instances on the battlefield with their badass selves, to fight against, vessel-sized things, man-on-the-wall-sized things, Hunhalis-sized things. Oh my. Yeah, I'm in. I'm in with that. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And in particular, got you thinking about the introduction of the actual characters, Sol and Lua, as well as, the additional references that we've already seen in the Devil's Triad, and what that could mean for the story in the long run. Will we find that there are more gods yet that can potentially help? Or that maybe have been corrupted themselves, or are they just a fairy tale? With the only real thing actually having any godlike abilities, our old friend Wally, and by extension us. I don't know, but I will say that we may find out really soon. At any rate, I hope you all tune in for next week's episode. And of course, I hope you all have a wonderful day today, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.